Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Concilio Better Places podcast, where I'm absolutely delighted today. We've gone international and we have James Johnson, who is currently in New York and one of the founding partners of JL Partners. James, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. International, but unfortunately still the English accent for your listeners to listen to here too. Not too exotic.
And a Folkestone half marathon T-shirt, which we were discussing earlier, is very niche for New York. But maybe James, just a little bit about yourself and JL Partners before we get into what we're here to talk about today.
Absolutely. So I started my career in politics by being the senior opinion research and strategy advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May. I got that role after the 2017 election, which obviously did not go so well for the Conservatives, despite them staying in power. I came in and led the post-mortem into what went wrong that I presented to the cabinet. And I was in her senior team running polling, focus groups, and the so what of that up until she left. After I left Number 10, I co-founded with my business partner, Dr. Tom Lubbock, the firm JL Partners. We are a polling research strategy firm. And as of 2023, I've been based out of the US, building the US company, JL Partners.
Yeah.
And most recently, we were the most accurate pollster of the 2024 election, one of the very few pollsters to project a win for Donald Trump.
And so I was at Reform Conference, which is where I met you. But I think it's quite interesting just to reflect on the American election there, because I imagine you were saying things that a lot of people didn't necessarily want to hear. Certainly, opinion formers didn't want to hear. And I kind of got that vibe at the Reform Conference. You are showing the facts. And people really need to understand the reality of what's going on. And this is what brings us here today: is the rise of reform as a national political force. We at Concilio have been undertaking a number of briefings for clients on this, and it struck me as, because there are only 5, 6 or 7, it keeps changing, reform MPs with defections and people even, they're not given as much voice as others, such as Liberal Democrats, who have 72 MPs. But Reform were the third largest party at the last general election, and I think what we're seeing now is a switch to actually they're using first past the post very well to probably manifest themselves into Parliament with a very large number of MPs if the election was held tomorrow.
I think that's right. And you're absolutely right that being on that, saying that Trump was going to win was an exposed position. But as
Yes.
a good advisors at Concilio, and we know as pollsters that if you always hedge and just say 50-50, when actually, though that might be the fashionable thing to say, the reality is very different. Then you're not providing insight and added value to clients. And I think it was clear to us, and one of the things that I think is really important that we do as a firm and have done and will continue to do is doing the polling and the data analysis, but also getting out onto the ground with real voters, having those face-to-face conversations. That was something that in America allowed us to pick up what was really happening on the ground. And it's something I see in the UK too. You might look at some of these polls where reform is doing very well, and you might think, how can that be backed up on the ground? But when you go and have conversations with voters about their disenchantment with the levels of immigration, about their disenchantment with the mainstream traditional parties, it soon clicks. This is very real, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
Thank you for that overview there, James. So what we're going to do, you're going to share your screen and go through the presentation that I saw you give at Reform, which explains the rise of Reform and how well they are doing. And I think it'll be absolutely fascinating to people watching and listening to this.
Great stuff. Well, hopefully you can see my screen there, and
Yes.
I'll dive in with what we did. So this presentation it takes into a few different it takes into account a few different data sources put together by us at JL Partners in partnership with Friderichs Advisory Partners. And the most important thing is we ran a poll that ended just at the start of September, so a little old now, but we don't think much has changed since. Just giving that overall sense of where the parties are, what is the state of the parties in the UK today. And we think that Reform has a 10-point lead over Labour. Reform on 32%, Labour on 22%, Conservatives on 18%, not a million miles off that doomed fourth place slot where the Lib Dems are on 12.
Yes.
So I think the first thing to say is that this is a huge transformation from where we were at the general election. Labour pulled in 34% of the vote there. The Conservatives close to 24, Reform down in the late teens. Clearly, there has been a big turnaround in the last 12 to 18 months since that election. And we are saying that at the moment, Reform are the main beneficiaries. Now, I want to go back to your point. If there was an election tomorrow, that's the question phrasing we use here, Reform will do well. This is not a prediction. This is a projection of where we are now. Plenty of time to run, but we think Reform are in a very strong position.
So many questions flow from this. I mean, I find when we're giving our briefings on the current electoral position, it's a lot of people can't accept that the Conservative Party is doing quite as badly as it is being shown in the polls, but also the drop in support in such a quick period of time for the Labour Party. Is that quite unprecedented to see a party win? Now, 32% of the vote, 100% of the power. So there was quite a disconnect between number of MPs in Parliament and the percentage vote if we were under a proportional system. But even given that, the drop in support for Labour is quite unprecedented, only a year in, surely.
It is significant. I think there are two ways of looking at this. I mean, on the one hand, being down in the low 20s is a very bad place to be for any party. And it is unprecedented in that regard to be quite so low quite so quickly. However, when you look at it in terms of the lead that Reform have, a 10-point lead for an opposition party at this stage in the Parliament is pretty normal for incumbent governments.
Right.
If you think of where Labour was for most of the Parliament under David Cameron, 2010 to 2015, they would often have 10-point leads. So because we're in a multi-party system with a new entrant in Reform, those numbers might look devastating, but actually, being 10 points behind, in some other polls only being 5 points behind, is not as horrific for Labour as it might look. The party that I'd be really worried about is the Conservatives here, because they are the natural party of opposition, or have been for a long time. They are the official opposition, but they are in the late teens in terms of support. And if they lose that challenger status to Labour, then we really could be looking at the next election as a real extinction event for the Conservatives if they can't turn this around. The last 12 months, we might not have had an election, but it has been a live election in practice for the voters on the right. And Kemi Badenoch has not won that contest. It's Reform who have filled that gap. They haven't wiped out the Tories, but goodness me, I would not want to be looking at this as a Tory strategist.
And we can see that by looking at the by-elections over the last year. Reform have been winning a lot of seats for the Conservatives and Labour, it must be said as well. I mean, in Wales, I always find it quite remarkable how well Reform are doing in Wales. In seats which the Conservative Party, as a traditional centre-right party, would never dream of having a hope in, and Reform are winning them. So it is quite a change coming, isn't it? Quite a change. But so what we're saying is it's the fact Reform are 10 points ahead is really the surprise, not that an opposition party is 10 points ahead of an incumbent government a year in.
Yes, and you'll see in some of the slides later that if you have a lead over your closest opponent, then you've got a very good chance of getting a majority. And if it's a double-digit lead, you have a very good chance. Even though Reform are only on 32%, they could win a barnstorming majority if these numbers are replicated.
Yeah. So just a reminder, what did Labour get at the last general election? 34%?
34%, yeah, when you looked at it nationwide, exactly.
Yeah.
So why have Labour gone down? This is the real sort of theme of our next slide. And we've gone back to the 90s, word cloud data visualization, which we find really useful. We ask the public, a representative sample of the public in that same poll, what are the biggest mistakes that the Labour government have made? And I think the real takeaway here is how pivotal that winter fuel allowance change was. Even a year on, more than a year on from those changes being made, people are still saying that they are the key mistake that the government made. And also in here is immigration. So there are frustrations about immigration, both legal and illegal. But really, it looks like that winter fuel allowance has been taken as sort of totemic of who Labour stands for. And that has shed some Labour support, both to the left, to parties like the Greens and the Lib Dems, but also direct to Reform.
We don't really hear that mentioned, certainly in the media, much anymore, winter fuel. But it's still there for the people you spoke to in lead up to the start of September. It's quite remarkable how it's not reported anymore, yet it's still there.
It is, and it's also remarkable how There was another poll this month, I think, by Lord Ashcroft that also showed just last week that the same thing, the same sort of finding. So these moments cut through for the public, and it takes quite a lot to unbuckle them. Remember, Labour has actually officially U-turned on this policy, but people haven't noticed the U-turn. They only remember what they saw. So that really has had a seismic effect.
Wow. Brilliant. Oh, that's fascinating to see. And certainly immigration looks like it's kind of the second most mentioned there, which I guess is kind of not a surprise. Yeah, pensioners and winter fuel. Okay, that's really interesting to see. That's what's turning people off the Labour Party.
Absolutely. Now, that's the negative. Why are people not voting Labour? But why are people voting Reform? So we asked people who either voted or are considering voting for Reform. Either would vote or... I'll start again. We asked people who are currently saying they'd vote Reform or would consider doing so, what would they say are the main reasons to vote for the party? And you can see there's a few things in here. The top result is that Reform would stop the boats crossing the English Channel. The second most popular is their policies to reduce overall immigration. And their third is they are patriotic and stand up for Britain. Note what isn't doing so well. Actually, not a huge amount of people saying it's because they're an alternative to the established mainstream. Not a lot of people saying it's because they're honest. They don't necessarily believe that this is a brand new political force that is going to be amazing. But you can see that they do think that they are likely to change things on immigration, which clearly is a huge priority for these voters and a clear failing, as we saw on that last slide, about for people in terms of how they view the Labour government. But I do think this third one is really important too. We talk a lot in polling. It's not all about policies. It's also about values. And the fact that they think Reform would stand up for Britain, that is a real sort of brand strength, to use marketing speak, for the Reform Party with voters.
And 42% is a lot, isn't it, when talking about these positions? Obviously, it's the third highest here, but that's quite a significant driver, isn't it, of 42%, 47% for those who are considerers and 42% for Reform voters. They must be quite a way out on the other parties, I'd assume, on that issue, or have you not polled for that?
I think that's right. They basically feel that the main parties have failed. And they have seen Conservative governments fail to control immigration, despite saying they would. And they have seen Labour, since the election, who they were willing to give a chance, not do so either. So, yeah, this is a big strong point for Reform. And the really interesting thing for Reform here is that, it's not just their current voters that think this. It's also people who would consider voting for Reform. And that's kind of the magic combination. If you're a party like Reform, you can win more people by doing what you're doing already.
They would be competent at running the country, only 15%. I can imagine a lot of people watching this who are members and or would vote for other parties thinking, surely that is the most important thing. And yet it's clearly not for people. So even though people do not think or proactively think they would be competent at running the country, they're willing to vote for them to run the country.
I think.
How do you square that out? Does it come down to values?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there. I think one is the general faith in any politician, including Reform, to be competent is so low because of recent events and situations that people are just not willing to give that badge to anyone. And the second thing is that I do believe that competence in that sort of, slightly sort of, who's going to be, the person to best manage the country, the sort of Rishi Sunak style brand, the David Cameron style brand, that sort of drier managerial appeal to voters has become less relevant over the last 10 years. And actually it is more important to share someone's values and to have that sense of you're going to get things done. That's what sort of really comes out to voters. So it's perhaps not necessarily how you would run a business or run a government. I'm not suggesting that politicians go and talk about how they'll be incompetent, but it's not the most important thing that a voter considers in the context of 2025.
That's fascinating. So I guess in terms of 2019, Boris got Brexit done. That was why he got elected. That was very much the slogan, wasn't it? So we're saying here it's kind of stop the votes, reduce immigration, whatever the phrase is the equivalent of that Boris simplicity, if you like, in 2019.
Totally, and they will use that as a proxy for competence. I think that's a really important thing to stress, is that, let's say that Rishi Sunak, when he stood up there in 2023 and said, I'm going to stop the votes, if he'd have done it, he'd still be Prime Minister. because people
Right.
would have gone, that shows that he's competent. Actually, they didn't fulfill the promises, and voters said, no thanks.
Yep.
So,
Well,
one thing that we
damning indictment, isn't it, on the mainstream, on the more traditional mainstream parties, isn't it? Wow.
exactly, it's not these slides are not a nice read if you're a Labour or Conservative politician. So what does the current coalition look like for Reform UK? Now, what I'm talking about here is not how it looked like in terms of who voted Reform in 2024, but who's saying they vote Reform now. And we're showing this because what we really want to sort of map out here is what is the path to power for Reform now. And we've done this for all the main parties, but we're obviously majoring on Reform here, partly because of their conference, but partly because they are the real interesting question right now, because they are the front runners. And we've done a segmentation of the electorate. These are pretty standard. Many listeners will have seen these kind of things before, some fancy names, some different groups. But the reason this is interesting is because of how significant this group that we've called pessimistic patriots. Pessimist patriots are in the Reform coalition. Almost half of their current support is in this group. Now, the best way of thinking about this group are the people that came over to the Conservatives under Theresa May in 2017, and that Boris Johnson extended support amongst in 2019. They are more likely to live in the North and the Midlands. They are more likely to be pessimistic about the trajectory of the country. They are more likely to have voted Leave. They are more likely to be anti-net zero. And they are more likely to be older, non-graduates, often working class or in blue-collar jobs. And they hugely prioritise immigration over other issues. So that is the real sort of foundation stone of Reform support. They do have other groups, though. They have these big state boomers who are basically the sort of pension vote, who are very keen to see more welfare spending and also, crucially, more pensions. And we've also got these two centrist groups, delivery-driven optimists and country-focused centrists. They are younger. They're slightly more likely to be having that moment where they're sort of buying a house for the first time. They're really sort of preoccupied by things like crime, the NHS, and public services, things that touch their lives every day. Less likely to be concerned about migration, but still of the view that it should be reduced. So you can see that sort of rainbow that Reform have managed to build, and that's what gives them the support they currently have.
I find the successful graduates at 1.9% telling, because I've been to Reform events where they say there's London, Oxford, Cambridge, possibly Brighton, Bristol and Bath could be added to that list, and then there's the rest of the country. And people living in said cities tend to be, a lot of people tend to be graduates, certainly attracted to those larger cities, and they seem completely unaware almost of what's going on with the opinion polling and how well Reform are doing around the country. I mean, we give a presentation, I said, and it's mainly to people based in London and Cambridge, and it's complete surprise to see how, on May the 1st, when the local elections, they won 10 councils, 2 mayoralties. They came second in the mayoralties. They didn't win. All the by-elections they're winning across the country. And yet it seems to be passing graduates, if you like, and I realise it's a sweeping broad brush, by. And Reform support tends to be for more blue-collar, non-graduate members of the community.
I think that's right. I think some of those, younger graduates, some of them, especially men, do lean a little bit more right than perhaps they did a few years ago.
Right.
But you're right. The broad base of Reform support is not in the cities and is not amongst people with higher education degrees. The reason that matters is a point that you made first, which is that they have used first past the post in a very clever way, and this is my most complicated graph, so bear with me, but it demonstrates that point. What we've done here is we've looked at, of those different segments that are part of Reform support, of those that they don't have, but they could still win, which are best for getting a majority in Parliament, which gives you the biggest bang for your buck in our system. And what you see here on the y-axis is the number of seats that you could get by pursuing a certain group. And on the x-axis is how many seats you would, basically your campaign effectiveness. So if you win 20% of that group, if you win 60% of that group, if you win 100% of that group, bring them together. And what we see on this graph is basically, if you are a certain level of effective with winning that group over, how many potential seats do you win? And what you see is that, firstly, the pattern is quite linear. So the more effective you get with each group, it goes up in relatively similar order of magnitude. But the number one takeaway here is that the pessimistic patriots give you the biggest seat uplift almost regardless of the level of effectiveness that you have relative to other groups. So we're saying that if you are 100% effective with the pessimistic patriots in terms of winning those over that Reform don't yet have, then you could win up to 125 seats more. If you went and focused on some of these smaller groups, you would still win seats, but you wouldn't win as many as you would with that group. Now, the reason that is important is because, as we've seen, they are a key part already of Reform support. So what we're saying is two things. One, there are more of these people for Reform to win. And two,
Right.
they give Reform a massive seat dividend. Now,
Yeah.
if I'm a Reform strategist, I am very, very happy with this graph, because what it is saying to me is that my basic strategy, my basic appeal, also allows me to win more votes in the places that matter.
Right.
They're not having to think, okay, we've got some voters locked in,
Yeah.
but we need to do something very different to win more voters, and maybe we'll lose some of our existing base. They don't have that strategic challenge that Labour does and the Conservatives have. They have a sort of almost a sort of one-way road to carry on driving down in order to win more seats. So that is a very, very, very promising place for a political party to be. And I have to say, it's pretty rare. Globally, we don't tend to see that.
It's interesting the online right is so low, because I think kind of noise is off, fat is the loudest, and it's very noticeable. And to their credit, in my opinion, this is my opinion, they are, Reform do not want to be associated with, for Tommy Robinson's Andrew Tate-esque online right. Even though that dominates the media, even though that dominates social media, it's not the path to go down to try and win votes from that crowd, if you like. They're far better off going for the, as I said, the pessimist patriots and a more centrist, dare I say, approach than what many online and therefore vocal critics are probably imploring them to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you look at some of the other groups that they can gain with, the big state boomers are a key point. So there's
Right.
there's quite a lot of these pensioners that are still with the Conservatives, despite having the potential to come around to Reform. And these sort of middle groups that you see, the delivery-driven optimists and the country-focused centrists. That's not to say that they need to ditch what they're saying now on things like migration. There is a route to power that Reform should use by being incredibly punchy on legal and illegal migration. What there is less strategic prize in doing is making some of those arguments to two of those groups, the online right group, as you see, but also the Freedom First group. And what these are essentially people who are much more likely to use things like X for politics. They are much more likely to see migration not as a public services challenge, but as a Islam versus Christianity, Islam versus the West sort of point of view. They are more likely to view immigration as a racial issue rather than a burden on the country issue, and they are also very likely to back in very, very low taxes, if not a single flat rate tax, and also a much, much smaller state. As you say, those people are very overrepresented online. They are the Tommy Robinsons, they are the Rupert Lows, but there's really not much benefit at all in Reform UK pursuing those people from a party point of view compared to the other groups. Now, you were there, that Reform conference hall, when I made that point, I did get I saw a few faces, going,
Yeah, no, there were.
not so sure. But that is what the numbers says, and I think it explains why we see Nigel Farage's strategy being so focused on those top four groups.
And it's interesting, like some of the other research I've seen shows that with respect to immigration, and you touched on this, I think it's a bit of a lazy stereotype to think it is about race. For a lot of Reform voters, it's actually about impacts on public services. That was the number one issue that, by quite a big majority from memory of the research I saw, that showed why people who vote Reform are concerned about immigration. Again, maybe lazy. I'm guilty of being a bit lazy here. I just thought maybe it was more about race and religion, but no, it was about public services. And that's the group that they need to go after. It's a concern on public services, not, as you said, those more fringe right movements who make an awful lot of noise, and the media focuses an awful lot of attention on, but it's not actually where Reform voters are.
Absolutely. And this is about impact on housing, it's about impact on the ability to get care at the NHS. This is about impact on schools where parents' children might be in classrooms where teachers having to balance different languages and different cultures. It's not purely pragmatic and about public services, there is that concern too that people's communities have changed too much, or that they haven't given permission, but that for such an increase in migration. But that's more about fairness than race, I think. And I think that is the really important distinction there that certainly comes through. Now, what we've then done is we've then extrapolated those voter groups onto what the impact in seats look like, and we've done a couple of different scenarios. So what we've done is we've assumed that Reform UK and the current polling is on about 150 seats. Now, actually, when you look at the current polling, and many people watching this or listening to this will know that some polls have Reform winning massive majorities at this stage. But let's assume that things tighten come a general election. Maybe the Conservatives show up a bit of support under a new leader. Maybe Labour rallies some of those left-wing voters back round them because they point to example to the threat of Farage for those left-wing voters. Let's say that Reform starts at around 150 seats. What they need to do to get the biggest lift, look at that huge lift, is targeting those pessimistic patriots. If they get 80% effectiveness with them, it gets them another 107 seats straight away. That's 150 to 257. Big state boomers, 50% effectiveness, that gets them an extra 30 seats. And if we go on to the next slide and continue this sort of experiment, you would expect some pickup with those fringe right groups. They're only slight, but you would still expect some pickup. But that only gets an extra 10 seats, a very small uplift. They're still only at 297. To get that over that dashed line that you see there, which is the majority mark, they need to also make some of those inroads in those large sort of middle England segments, which we talked about. People focused on crime, housing, rents, performance of the NHS. Now, even only small improvements, only 20% and 15% effectiveness, get big returns in seats, and that takes them over the line to 3 to 8. Now, we have counted for some small losses amongst some of those more left and centre left segments. I do think that the next election is going to become Starmer versus Farage, or whoever the Labour leader is versus Farage, and that will bring some of those left-wing voters back to the Labour fold. But we think that if that happens in the way that we think it will here, that Reform is basically at majority level on 317. Now, from going from 5 seats at the general election in 2024
isn't it?
to 317, that's a pretty good place to be. Here's what it looks like if you go after the online right and the freedom first groups first. You do still do well with the pessimistic patriots. You can see that big uplift there. You don't do as well, but you still do pretty good. But you take a much bigger loss with those middle England segments who are really put off by some of that language that those groups use. You take a blow with them because they're so big. It actually puts you down to 259. Now, that's still coalition material if you wanted to work with the Conservatives, say, but we don't think that it's enough to win a majority. And you can see that danger there for Reform. And again, you can see why Farage is making some of the decisions he's making in terms of keeping his distance from the sort of Rupert Lowe's and Tommy Robinsons of this world.
And one of the issues which I saw constantly raised at Reform Conference was net zero. And in fact, it was interesting that I think it was only 18% on one of your earlier slides had net zero as a reason they would vote for Reform. And I understand the point being made about the impact on energy bills, impact that has on inflation and so on. But that's probably not a topic that is going to drive a lot of votes for Reform. It doesn't look like. They do really need to focus on issues, as I said, immigration, crime, rather than net zero, where I think it's such a different position to what everyone else has taken. I can see that putting off quite a lot of more centrist voters who might be interested in Reform on those other issues.
Yeah, I think that's half right. I think that the pessimistic patriots are very skeptical of net zero now in a way that perhaps they weren't 5 years ago.
Okay,
because they have basically seen the potential cost to them. And I think really since that sort of inflation spike after the pandemic, a bit of that support went away. And I think the Middle England groups have become a little less concerned. But I do think you are right that Reform do not want to make that a complete centerpiece of their campaign. Because the idea of wanting to protect the environment is still really important. to some of those middle England groups. They might disagree with some of the means to get there, but they don't want it to be sort of thrown away down, or sort of buried underneath everything else. So I would say that there's not too much risk of them being actively anti-net zero, but I would say that really, if they really want to appeal to those centrist groups, they need to be talking more about the NHS, more about pensions, more about crime.
Got it. What happens to the Conservative Party? Just before we touch on this next one, because the assumption, I mean, my assumption would be it's centre-right voters who are going to reform predominantly more than people who historically have voted Labour. I don't know if that's correct, but that would, or people would be maybe inclined to vote Conservative. The Conservative Party is in real trouble if this polling is accurate.
Totally. Look, in the scenario, in the best, a good case scenario for reform, the Conservatives are in dire straits.
Yep.
Now, the interesting thing is that when I said there's more of these pessimistic patriots for reform to win, I'm just quickly trying to do the maths. 80% of them, 80% of the pessimistic patriots that reform can still win are in the Conservative Party currently.
Wow.
So the Conservatives have a lot more losses to make. Actually, only 20% of them are in the Labour Party, because a lot of them have been lost already from Labour. And actually, a lot of Labour's votes now are people on the left. So Conservatives should be very worried indeed. And also, if reform can successfully target pensioners who are sticking with the Conservatives, then you could see a real collapse in Tory support. Could a change in leader shore things up for the Conservatives? Could a disaster with Farage or infighting in reform put the Conservatives back on the map? It's very possible. But the Conservatives are now vying with a very effective alternative party. And the reason they're effective is because they're new. They haven't been in government, and people are so fed up with those who have been or are currently in government that gives them a real plus point. So yes, if I were the Conservatives, we're heading into their conference very shortly, I would be very worried indeed about where UK polling currently is for them.
One of the takeaways I had from Reform Conference was just how many ordinary members were there in relation to other party conferences that I go to, and there's a real energy amongst. So as well as that new point we're taking firm, and since it's new, because it's got members who are excited, who really want to get out there and spread the message of reform, which we certainly don't see with the Conservative Party anymore, and maybe Liberals to an extent. They've got an energy on the centre right, which the Conservatives are struggling to match in terms of their membership base at the moment.
They totally do. And let me take my scientific polling hat off for a moment. But anecdotally, I think that's absolutely right. The thing I was struck by at Reform Conference was how many normal people were there.
Yes,
we had made a joke about my Folkestone half marathon T-shirt, but it is the people that I grew up with and knew in Folkestone. It's people who are less likely to have gone to uni. They're also successful. They're people who have gone and set up their own taxi businesses or electricians or plumbers. And they're fed up with the situation. You don't often see those people at party conferences. And I think they were there at Reform.
Not at all. That struck me as well. Yeah, it really struck me as well. As well, it was nice to see so many people involved in politics, which you just don't tend to see.
Absolutely.
At party conferences.
I've got a couple of final slides for you. Where does Reform need to grow then? Well, what we've done here is we've asked people which party you trust most to handle each of the following issues. And it's interesting. Reform have a big, almost 20-point lead over Labour on immigration and asylum. Fascinating, by the way, that Labour are more trusted on immigration and asylum than the Conservatives. That really shows you how much the Conservative record in government is holding them down.
Just slight aside, the Conservatives are behind on everything.
It's a good point. Yes,
I think I'm right in saying that.
Yeah, I think the closest they come is on defence and the economy, isn't it? And pensions. But they're not ahead on anything. Brexit Reform also have a good lead, and they're doing well on a couple of other issues too. But they clearly do have some work to do on things like cost of living. They're 35 there, score draw with Labour. And you might think, Labour have been in power for a year and cost of living is still high. Inflation's back up to levels that I think it's the highest in the G7, the OECD said this week.
Right. Yep.
So, you'd expect Reform to be doing a bit better there. The economy, they've only got a 2-point lead. NHS, Labour still have an 8-point lead on that issue. So for reform to reach into those middle England groups that we talked about and to put at rest some of the concerns that pensioners might have. I mean, look at pensions down the bottom, fourth from the bottom.
Yeah.
Reform 33,
So-
Labour 36, Conservative 31. Reform have
I
not
think most
reassured people on
Wow.
pensions either. So they need to broaden out, is the point of this slide.
I find that fascinating because again, a slightly lazy view, which I might have held if I'm honest, is that older people will vote reform. But if reform aren't doing well on pensions, they're not going to win that older voter. Why do you think they're struggling on that issue?
Totally. And I think this is one of the misconceptions out there about reform support. It's actually
Hmm.
more late working age people who form the bulk of the party support, not pensioners. And there's two sides of that, right? One is like, that's bad for reform because there are lots of those people. The other side is, if they can win that over 65 segment, which is huge because of our aging population and also
Yes.
how many of them vote, then there is huge upside. In terms of the reasons why, look, I think one thing that the Conservatives have been very effective at over the last really 20 years is reassuring their voters, who pensioners tend to be, that their pension will be safe under the Tories. And I think the triple lock protection on pensions, which the Conservatives did stick to in government, there's lots to be said for its efficacy as a policy, but it has given the impression to voters that their pension is broadly protected. And I think, reform are not going to win many of the Labour votes on this graph on pensions, but they really could chip into that 31% who are still saying Conservative. And I think, they need to be, it's two things when you're thinking about pensions. One is, would you protect pensions in the first place? And I think there is a tension in reform's activist base on this. I think some people who are on the more younger side would actually quite like to see the triple lock removed so that they could do more bold things on, for example, investment for younger people. And then I think there's another part of the party which would like to see those protections be put in place. So, there's a tension there. But I think there's another thing for pensioners that they're thinking about, which is strong pensions usually means a strong economy. And they still worry about reform's ability to manage that economy well. And I think that's something that they also would need to reassure those older voters on. So that is definitely a weakness for reform as it stands. But also the prize, if they do manage to address it, is huge in terms of the number of voters they could unlock.
Right. Fascinating.
But it's interesting, right? Because like you say, people aren't really aware of that. Like the roadblock to reform support at the moment, the thing that's holding them back from 40% is actually the pension vote.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people will be taking that away from this podcast, because I before I saw this presentation, my assumption was it was the older population.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, that kind of fits in with what we saw at conference with those who were attending, which was working age people.
Yeah.
More than pensioners.
You're right.
That's
You're
certainly
right.
true.
It's my Folkestone white van man, right? That's the kind of people who were there, not your.
Well, I joke there was more Ford Wild Tracks in the car park there than a Ford dealership. As the working man descended on Birmingham. But again, it shows reform's touch. It was free parking and £20 a ticket.
There we go. There we go.
Try and go to Tory or Labour conference.
You're
talking hundreds and hundreds of pounds.
Yeah,
so
you're absolutely right. I mean, look, I ran an event there, right? And it was a lot cheaper for me to run that event there than it would be at a Tory or Labour conference. Now maybe they'll change that and really rinse their sponsors in the next couple of years as they become more popular. But it was certainly more accessible in that regard. Final slide for you. It's just something we worked on, which is just how important emotions are going to be in campaigning too. And this is actually going back to the election last year. We ran a poll in Clacton in partnership with Friderichs Advisory Partners on Farage, and we asked people what emotions they felt when they sort of heard or saw or thought about Nigel Farage. And you can see just how important he is in terms of building support for reform. People said they were interested, attentive. They felt strong hearing him. Thought that was really interesting when we talk about people being powerless. Alert, enthusiastic, determined, excited, inspired. It shows you how important it is to have a powerful personality at the head of a party. And I think, again, you can read this two ways. The optimistic view for reform is, this is fantastic. Farage is our guy. he appeals to people in a way that other politicians don't. I think that's right. I think, by the way, that his appearance in the jungle and I'm a Celebrity was absolutely crucial in doing that. I think a lot of these results wouldn't look quite so good if he hadn't have had that stint. It broadened his appeal out to a lot of people that he otherwise wasn't reaching. The flip side, though, is Farage has to maintain these numbers for 4 long years.
Yes, yeah, long time.
It is tough to be a front runner for that long. You know, that's the pessimistic view, is can he hold on to it? And that's going to be the key question, I think, going forward.
Questions often asked, and I obviously literally don't have an answer because we don't know, but if Nigel Farage fell under the proverbial bus tomorrow, what would happen to reform? How much of reform is cult of personalities too strong? But clearly there is a strong Nigel Farage vote amongst reform supporters. Does reform exist without Nigel Farage as we see it today? Can it maintain these numbers in the polls if Nigel Farage was not leading the party?
I've got a pretty strong view on this. I don't think it can. I think that a huge bulk of reform support comes from Farage. I think it's helped them become well known because he's such a well known politician. And he's also got an ability to connect, as you see on these numbers here, that other politicians just don't. If reform got into government under Farage and then Farage stepped down, I think that's different, because then it becomes about who's going to be the next PM. They have a platform. They have, you know, a default right to be heard. I think that therefore means that reform can continue. But if it happens before they get into government, if Farage is not the leader by the time of the next election, then I think that's a bad place for reform to be in, mainly because there's no obvious successor. And also, one thing that we do know that's happened with parties that Farage has been in charge of over the last few years is they do end up in a lot of infighting. And if he's not at the top, I think we could see a real nasty scrap for who becomes leader. And I don't think that's going to look good to the public. It'll be that's the last hope for the Conservatives, right? That either, you know, there's a big amount of infighting that forces Farage out, or that Farage is no longer leader. And at that point, if voters do turn back to the Conservatives, there's a chance for recovery. But if Farage can maintain these numbers, then it's hard to see how he gets shunted off the whole position.
Yep. But as you've said very accurately, 4 years is an awful long time. And anything can happen in those 4 years. So James, thank you very, very much for your time today. Some absolutely fascinating insights there. Certainly the collapse of the Tory party, and really whether reform can hold this lead is going to be what we're going to be watching closely over the next 4 years. So yes, thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you've got anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye.
I think that's the main thing. I mean, you know, we have seen a seismic move in British politics. It is a very exciting time to be a UK politics watcher. I remember people saying to me, I'm sure you had this as well. You know, we advise clients on politics. You from the you know, communications and you know, risk point of view. Me from the what do the numbers say point of view. I thought we had a whopping Labour majority, that people weren't going to be that interested in UK politics for a few years. It was going to be boring. It ain't boring. And actually, both of our industries have become more relevant actually since that election because of how fragile things are. And I think that really speaks to, you know, what Farage has done, but also how volatile the voters are in terms of how frustrated they are with the status quo. And I would say, you know, do not bet on the next few years being quiet and stable, because voters are very, very frustrated and angry. And I'd say to your clients and people listening, you know, do a focus group. You know, go and listen to those voters in places like Grimsby, because they are mightily pissed off, and it gives that insight into where things might be headed over the next few years.
Yeah, I think next year's local elections are going to be potentially transformative in many respects, because there's going to be an awful lot of change and an awful lot of angry voters, and I think that will have potentially national repercussions, maybe for both Conservative and Labour. And I think we're certainly going to see a lot more reform-led councils. I mean, Wales and Scotland in particular also looking absolutely fascinating for reform and how well they could do there. So, James, thank you very much for sparing your time this afternoon, and good luck with growing the business in America.
Thank you.